As you can see, this is my cat India, and she's decided to join me. Just kind of like a James Bond villain here. I've got as my wife often says, I have a cat in my lap, and I'm trying to work on doing something about geopolitics. And I obviously have no villain is complete without an evil cat to go along with this. Although this kitty is a lot sweeter. Uh, when we when we last left off, we were getting into the Cold War aspect of the United Nations because problems are going to start. You'll remember with Churchill, FDR, and Stalin, they all have different motives about how things are going to go down. In fact, there's a good movie that came out with all these presidents, prime ministers, and leaders. You had Michael Caine play Joseph Stalin, Bob Hoskins played Winston Churchill, and John Lithgow, I believe, played the United States President Roosevelt. And it dealt with how these leaders interacted with each other at critical times. One of the key moments in the Cold War UN starts right off during the Korean War, where we now know, though we didn't know at the time, that Joseph Stalin basically ordered Kim Il sung to attack South Korea. And Kim Il sung was the communist dictator in charge of North Korea. Now, the Soviet Union had left a lot of tanks, planes, a lot of military hardware. The United Nations did not, or the U.S. did not leave as many troops in South Korea. They'd been occupied by Japan since 1910, and we left a small force there. But what we now know is that North Korea just unprovoked attacked South Korea to try and militarily dominate the Korean Peninsula. And it did not take long for the United Nations to act. Now, there was a bit of fortune for the United States within the UN because the Soviet Union was angry with the United Nations. And so at a critical time, the Soviet ambassador to the UN marched out of the League of Nations, not to leave like Japan did, but in a similar show to try and intimidate the UN. And what the US did is they used that opportunity to call for a quick vote on the Korean War. And without Soviet Union to cast a veto, which all the great powers would get. The great powers of the UN being the Allied powers, the five key Allied powers: United States, Great Britain, Russia, along with France and China. And this was the Taiwan China, not the communist China, who had taken over in 1949. And so what happened was the US and 16 other countries voted to send troops to help South Korea. And this was a big deal. I mean, most of the troops came from the United States, but still, every soldier over there helps, especially when the U.S. had troops in Germany, Japan, and other Cold War hotspots. And it was put under UN command, though always in charge by a U.S. military leader. Initially Douglas MacArthur, later Matthew Ridgway, and finally Mark Clark, which I spoke in the Mark Clark Hall at Citadel one time. Gave a presentation there. But this would be a UN command. Now, critics of the Cold War did or of the UN, point out that not all the major powers participated. Most minor powers gave military aid, even if they didn't send troops, or supported sanctions against North Korea. Not every one of them did, but most of them did. Critics also point out that it was more likely to be a USA mission. By the way, that image that you see on slide 7 is from the Korean War Memorial, which was designed and put into play when I was a senior in college. I was an altar boy, and one of the priests I worked for, he was a chaplain during the Korean War, and always told me stories about that and how difficult it is. Definitely recommend you read some literature about the Korean War and the sacrifice of the U.S. Marines and the Army. Frozen Chosen. See if you can look up something about them. Uh, and when the Soviet Union did return to the United Nations after their brief walkout, they were very unhappy with the first Secretary General. His name was Trygve Lie. He's from Norway, and Norway was an ally of the United States and Britain during World War II. And in fact, the British helped the Norwegians' resistance against the German occupation. And Norway was a member of NATO. So the Soviet Union did what they could, and they forced Trygve Lie to resign before the end of his term. And in fact, a new Secretary General was chosen, Dag Hammarskjöld. The Soviet Union, one of their complaints was that Trygve Lie should have never allowed that vote on the Security Council when the Soviet Union marched off in protest, even though it's the Soviets' own fault for doing that. The hope was that Sweden, which was not a NATO member and not an explicit ally of the United States or the Soviet Union, would be more neutral. However, even the Soviet Union was angry or became angry over time with Dag Hammarskjöld, and they demand he resign as well, and that the Secretary General's office be abolished and replaced by a representative from the U.S., a representative from the Soviet Union, and I think somebody from the Third World. But Dag Hammarskjöld from Sweden refused such a demand and said that he would stay in place, and he got a lot of cheers from the UN, and the attempt of the Soviet Union to get rid of him failed. You saw under Dag Hammarskjöld the rise of UN peacekeeping. It's listed as his initiative, but in fact, I believe the idea came from a Canadian diplomat. And this was, I may as well tell you the origin story of peacekeeping. What happened was, in the first time it was contemplated was at a time when Egypt and Israel were in confrontation. The king of Egypt had been overthrown, and a military dictator took over. Kind of junior generals, lower level military officers took power, and they wanted to create a pan-Arabic movement. They even changed Egypt's name to United Arab Republic. They wanted to unite all the Arabic peoples under the leader of Egypt, Gamal Abdel Nasser, of course. And I think for a while, Syria also became a United Arab Republic. They tried to convince others to do so. They were trying to overthrow monarchies and install leaders sympathetic to this military guy, Gamal Abdel Nasser. Well, one of Nasser's goals was to destroy Israel. So one of the things he did is, at some point, he took in his military to occupy the Suez Canal. And that's right where the Mediterranean Sea and the Red Sea come together. It's one of the most busy waterway access points in the whole world. Well, at any rate, Egypt not only took charge of the Suez Canal, but they also blocked it to Israeli shipping. If you know anything about Israel, Israel's got ports on the Mediterranean Sea, but they also have a port on their southern end off the Red Sea. I think it's called Eliat. But it's much easier to travel by boat around Israel than go through the inhospitable Negev desert in southern Israel. So the mission of Nasser was to close down Suez Canal to break Israel economically. In response to taking over the canal, Britain, France, and Israel teamed up with their military and attacked Egypt to retake the Suez Canal. The Soviet Union, who supported Nasser because he had a lot of ideas about Arab socialism, the Soviet Union threatened to nuke all three countries, Britain, France, and Israel. And this is 1956, right in the middle of a U.S. election. And so Dwight D. Eisenhower didn't want World War III, but he didn't want to abandon support for Britain, France, and Israel. So times were very tough. And so this Canadian diplomat had an idea of a neutral peacekeeping force that would go in. Countries like India, Ireland, and Yugoslavia And Yugoslavia was a communist country, but they didn't like the Soviets much. So they were not in alliance with the Soviets. In fact, they did not like each other, the dictator of Yugoslavia and the leaders of the Soviet Union. But if you had this neutral country, lightly armed peacekeepers, not threatening to anyone, they would control the Suez Canal, and that would bring peace. And sure enough, it stopped the Suez Crisis from becoming World War III. Um, now, both now peacekeepers can't just come on in. They have to have permission from the warring sides. They are not to create peace. They're there to keep peace. So once there is a ceasefire agreed upon by the warring sides, which pressure was brought on all those countries to agree to a ceasefire, the neutral countries came in and the Suez Canal was open to everyone. It would be in Egyptian hands. So it's like, because nobody wins, everybody wins. One of those. Um, the idea worked so well that the UN Secretary General tried to export this to another conflict in Congo. And the mission there is called ONUC. It's for the mission in Congo. Congo is in Central Africa. And the problem with Congo is that the country had forces loyal to the West, forces loyal to the Soviet Union. A president and prime minister disagreed with each other. The Belgians, who used to colonize it, brought in mercenaries to take the richest areas. Uh, Everything fell apart. The prime minister was murdered. Uh, Belgian mercenaries tried to take power.